Have you ever walked into a room knowing that one glance could change everything? Marvel Park did. The second she stepped into Jamil Bright's office, that knowledge hit her like electricity. Across the sleek, minimalist room, he looked up from his documents, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. Jamil Bright was impossibly commanding, every bit the billionaire CEO that rumors whispered about in hushed tones, sharp jawline, impeccably tailored suit, eyes that could dissect a person in a single look. He had a presence that demanded attention, and in that instant, Marvel knew she could not pretend she was immune to it. She had known who he was before accepting the job, his empire, his wealth, the power he wielded over everything from boardrooms to contracts. She knew he was married to Miriam Tomford, a woman whose name carried prestige, whispers, and admiration in equal measure. Still, seeing him in person, Marvel understood the danger of proximity. He was not just a man to admire from afar. He was a man whose energy could make her pulse quicken and her thoughts falter. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Jamil's gaze held hers, steady, measured, assessing, but not cold. He noticed her confidence, the way she walked into his office without hesitation, the subtle poise that suggested she was not merely another assistant, easily controlled. Most people crumbled under his presence. She did not. And yet the air between them hummed with tension, quiet but undeniable, a pull neither could deny. Marvel adjusted her bag and straightened her blazer. She had promised herself professionalism above all else. She would not falter, would not be distracted, would never cross lines. And yet, in that charged moment, she wondered if such rules were even possible with a man like him. Jamil's hand lingered on the documents before him, but his attention was fully on her. He had managed empires, investors, and crises, but she was different. She moved with intelligence, grace, and authority, an unexpected spark that unsettled him, intrigued him, and made restraint more difficult than it had been in years. He had never met an assistant like her, one who could both challenge and captivate him without a word spoken. Throughout the day, their interactions were electric, subtle yet charged. Marvel anticipated his requests, handled the tasks he gave her, and yet she found herself noticing the small things, the slight tilt of his head when he observed her work, the faint crease in his brow when she corrected an error before he noticed, the way he sometimes lingered a second too long in her presence. There was respect in his gaze, yes, but also something deeper, something unspoken, something that made the boundaries feel dangerously thin. Jamil, meanwhile, found himself drawn in ways he hadn't expected. He was a man of control, accustomed to obedience and deference, yet Marvel did not command through fear or status. She commanded through presence, intelligence, and subtle defiance. He could not help but notice the way she moved, the careful precision of her actions, the quiet confidence that radiated from her. Every glance she gave, every decision she made, reminded him of all the restraint he had promised himself, restraint he was beginning to question. By evening, the office had emptied of other staff, leaving only the glow of city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows. Marvel organized the final reports for the day, her hands steady but her chest tight with unspoken awareness. Jamil observed quietly, not intruding, yet every movement she made seemed amplified in the stillness. The professional distance they both maintained was palpable, yet the energy between them was undeniable. A quiet, electric intimacy born of attention, proximity, and unspoken understanding. Marvel gathered her belongings, noting how each second in his presence felt heavier, charged with a tension she could not ignore. Jamil returned to his papers, but his thoughts lingered on her. This was a woman who had entered his world and unsettled the carefully controlled life he had built, all without a word beyond the formalities required by professionalism. He knew boundaries existed, but in Marvel Park, he found those boundaries tempting to cross, intriguing to challenge, impossible to forget. When Marvel walked out into the evening, the city alive beneath her, she carried the weight of what had begun. A quiet, forbidden connection, a line drawn clearly yet already fraying at the edges. Jamil remained in the office, staring at the skyline as though it held answers he had never considered seeking. Two people, caught in tension and desire, aware of rules they could not break yet feeling the magnetic pull of crossing them. And in that silent, charged understanding, the first thread of their story had been woven, a thread neither could ignore. The following days blurred together with a rhythm that neither Marvel Park nor Jamil Bright could escape. Their interactions were no longer simple transactions of work. They carried weight, a gravity that drew them closer without either admitting it. Marvel found herself arriving earlier than necessary, reviewing schedules and reports she didn't yet need, just for the fleeting moments of proximity. Jamil noticed immediately, though he said nothing. He observed her with the same quiet intensity that had marked their first meeting, a subtle acknowledgement that went beyond professionalism. Late nights became routine. The office, normally sterile and impersonal, transformed into a private world where conversation, hushed and deliberate, lingered over topics that had nothing to do with work. Jamil rarely spoke of personal matters, yet Marvel, sharp and attentive, began to notice the small details. The flicker of tiredness beneath his otherwise composed exterior, the rare softening of his gaze when discussing future ventures, the unspoken frustrations he carefully buried beneath measured tones. She offered suggestions, insights, even a quiet laugh when moments demanded it. Each interaction was professional in appearance, but beneath it simmered an undeniable intimacy. Jamil, for his part, felt the unusual weight of reliance settling over him. Marvel's competence was extraordinary, but it was more than skill that drew him in. It was presence, the sense that she understood him in ways most could not. He began to anticipate her input, seeking her counsel not just because it was smart, but because he found comfort in her perspective, a rare clarity he had not realized he craved. The boundaries of employer and assistant, so clearly defined at first, grew fragile under the steady pull of their unspoken connection. There were private flights, brief trips to meetings across the city, each opportunity a small test of control. Seated together in the car, Marvel found herself noting every small gesture, the way he adjusted the rearview mirror, the calm steadiness of his hands on the wheel, the subtle warmth of proximity that made her pulse quicken. She forced herself to remain composed, but each ride, each shared glance, left a lingering tension that neither could deny. Jamil felt it too, a quiet magnetism that intensified in the confined space, a draw that made his thoughts linger long after the journey ended. Even the smallest touches carried weight. A hand brushing a stack of documents, a momentary brush as she handed him a folder, the accidental touch on the shoulder while pointing something out. They were fleeting, mundane, yet loaded with a subtle charge neither could ignore. Marvel's heart beat faster in those instances, but she forced herself to focus on efficiency, precision, professionalism. Still, the awareness of his presence lingered long after she left the room. The emotional dependence grew quietly, almost imperceptibly. Jamil began to rely on Marvel in ways that had nothing to do with work. Her opinions, her insights, her very calm in the midst of his high-pressure life became anchors. He noticed how naturally she diffused tension, how she interpreted the moods of board members and clients before he did, how she seemed to anticipate his unspoken thoughts. Slowly, without acknowledgement, he began to confide in her, first in minor details, then in moments that revealed a hint of vulnerability. Marvel, in turn, found herself listening differently. She had promised herself detachment, but there was a thrill in being needed beyond her job description. The emotional closeness, the sense of being the only one who could steady him in stormy moments, made her feel simultaneously powerful and exposed. She had entered his office to work, to learn, to grow, yet she discovered herself entwined in a connection that she had not planned, one that challenged every boundary she had intended to maintain. Late evenings carried their own tension. The office quieted around them, lights dimmed, the hum of the city a distant backdrop. Marvel filed the last of the documents, organizing not just papers but the rhythm of a life she did not yet fully understand. Jamil remained nearby, reviewing reports, yet his attention flickered to her frequently, subtle but undeniable. They shared these moments in silence, yet the silence spoke volumes, acknowledging the pull, the intrigue, the electric awareness of each other's presence. In these hours, emotional dependence wove itself into their lives. Marvel noticed how often she sought his approval without realizing it, how the brush of his glance could unbalance her, how the smallest acknowledgement from him could lift the weight of the longest day. Jamil recognized how he counted on her presence more than he expected, how her insights, her calm, and her focus became part of the rhythm he relied on, soothing the parts of himself he rarely exposed. And yet no lines had been crossed beyond attention and anticipation. The connection was quiet, but it was undeniable. Two people, entangled in the demands of work and the undercurrents of attraction, teetered closer and closer to a boundary neither dared to name aloud. Each glance, each moment of closeness, left traces on their thoughts, lingering long after the office lights went dark. By the end of the week, the pattern was unmistakable. They were drawn together not just by necessity but by the subtle gravity of emotional dependence. Marvel's presence calmed him, his focus anchored her, and in that balance a tension simmered, delicate yet insistent, hinting at a danger neither had the courage or the desire to confront. The first threads of a forbidden connection had woven themselves quietly, invisibly, and yet completely. In the hush of the office, as the city lights sparkled beyond the glass walls, both understood without speaking that they were no longer simply employer and assistant. Something had shifted. Something intangible yet irresistible had begun to grow, a magnetic, emotional bond that neither had sought but both now relied upon. And though they did not yet cross the line of temptation, the line itself trembled under the weight of unspoken desire, a quiet prelude to a story neither could resist. The office was quiet that night, quieter than usual. The hum of the city below was a soft backdrop, a distant reminder of a world that did not exist inside these walls. Marvel Park lingered longer than necessary, organizing files that could have waited until morning, her mind elsewhere. Jamil Bright sat across the room, reviewing proposals with an intensity that usually left him impervious to distractions. Yet tonight, the distraction was different. It was her. He noticed the subtle shift the moment she entered the office, a careful lightness in her steps, the way her eyes scanned the room before settling on him. She had promised herself professionalism, but he could sense the tension beneath her poise. Her fingers brushed against the stack of reports, lingering a second longer than necessary. The small movements, the tilt of her head, the brief catch in her breath when he looked at her, were amplified in the silence, an invisible signal neither dared to name aloud. Jamil leaned back slightly, letting the quiet stretch, letting the moment hold. There had been countless late nights before, filled with work and the unspoken electricity that had grown between them. But tonight felt different. Something fragile, delicate, had shifted in the space between them. He could sense it, a vibration that traced along the edges of his restraint, testing the limits he had long imposed on himself. Marvel adjusted her posture, forcing her attention to the documents, but she could not shake the awareness of him. The way he studied her, quiet and deliberate, made her pulse quicken. She had walked the tightrope of emotional dependence for days, managing proximity, managing attention, managing the invisible pull that drew them together. But tonight the line felt thinner than ever, and she realized that restraint was a tenuous thing, fragile in its beauty and easily broken. Jamil closed the file he had been reviewing, a slow, deliberate motion, and finally rose from his seat. He moved with the ease of authority, the kind of presence that could fill an entire room without speaking a word. He stopped near the edge of her workspace, just close enough for proximity to matter, yet careful not to cross an invisible barrier. She felt the warmth of him before she felt the intent, the subtle gravity that made her aware of every heartbeat, every breath. The first touch was accidental, deliberate only in the inevitability of it. As he handed her a folder, their hands brushed, fingers lingering longer than the task required. Marvel froze for a fraction of a second, acutely aware of the shock of electricity running through her, a spark she had felt before but never so sharply. Jamil noticed too, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, a recognition that this fleeting connection carried weight neither had expected. They pulled away, both pretending the brief contact had meant nothing, yet the air was charged with something neither could articulate. That night, as she prepared to leave, Marvel realized with startling clarity that she had already begun to depend on him in ways she had sworn she would not. She relied on the attention that carried both approval and challenge, on the subtle guidance that steadied her when the pressure of the job threatened to overwhelm, on the unspoken understanding that existed only between them. Jamil, meanwhile, felt the unusual tug of attachment, a subtle awareness that her presence had become more than convenience or duty. He relied on her insight, on her composure, on her ability to see the man behind the empire. And with that reliance came a danger, the kind of intimacy that had no boundaries, only unspoken rules. As the night deepened, Marvel paused in the doorway, glancing back at him. Jamil met her gaze, and for a fleeting second the office held only the two of them, two people aware of the risk, aware of the rules, yet drawn together by a force they could not resist. They did not speak. Words would have spoiled the gravity, would have forced acknowledgement they were not ready to confront. Instead, they lingered in the shared silence, hearts sinking in unspoken rhythm, aware that something had begun that could never be entirely undone. The first secret was simple in action but monumental in consequence, an unintentional touch, a glance that held too long, an acknowledgement of desire neither was willing to name. It was a crossing, subtle but permanent, a quiet step over the line they had carefully drawn. Both understood the risk, his marriage, her professional boundaries, the reputation of the empire they navigated, but in that moment the temptation of connection outweighed the danger. They had begun a secret without speaking a word, a thread of intimacy that tied them together in ways neither could admit. Walking to the elevator, Marvel felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and guilt. She had maintained professionalism in theory, but the night had revealed a vulnerability, a crack in her resolve she had not anticipated. Jamil, returning to his office, sat in silence for several long minutes, reflecting on the pull she had on him. He had faced challenges, betrayals, crises of every kind, but Marvel Park was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She had entered his life quietly, subtly, and now she had become a necessity, an emotional anchor, and a temptation all at once. By the time the city lights faded beneath them, the first secret had been sealed, unspoken and invisible to the outside world, yet powerful enough to alter the course of both their lives. Neither crossed the line explicitly, yet the line itself had shifted, stretched, and weakened. And both knew that from this point forward, nothing would be the same. They had taken the first step into a forbidden space, one charged with desire, tension, and the intoxicating allure of what could not be openly acknowledged. Jamil Bright had built his life around control. Every decision, every move, every relationship was measured, calculated, protected by invisible walls he had mastered over decades. And yet Marvel Park had arrived like a gust of wind in a carefully sealed room, unbalancing everything with a glance, a presence, a quiet insistence that he noticed her beyond her professional role. The first secret had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but its weight was undeniable. He found himself thinking about her in moments when he should not. Not in the boardroom, where numbers and contracts demanded his full attention, but in private moments, in the quiet spaces between meetings, in the lingering shadows of his office after everyone else had left. He noticed how her hair caught the light when she leaned over a document, how the focus in her eyes drew him in, how her calm certainty softened the edges of his otherwise sharp world. And he hated himself for it, for the weakness it implied, for the breach of the rules he had long imposed on himself. Marvel, for her part, wrestled with a guilt that surprised her. She had entered this role expecting only professionalism, but each interaction with Jamil carried a weight that made her heart race and her mind betray her intentions. She could not explain why his approval mattered more than anyone else's, why a fleeting smile from him could lift the stress of a week, why the quiet intimacy of proximity felt both thrilling and dangerous. Her promise to herself, to remain untouchable, unshaken, untouched, was eroding, subtle strand by subtle strand. The imbalance of power made every moment between them heavier. Jamil was the CEO, the man who held the weight of an empire in his hands, the man whose marriage reminded her constantly of the line she should never cross. And yet, in the office, in the small private spaces that existed only between them, he leaned on her emotionally in ways he would never admit aloud. He sought her counsel not only for work, but because he trusted her instincts, because he needed the perspective only she seemed capable of offering. It was intoxicating for her to be relied upon, and terrifying in equal measure. Late nights became the backdrop for their silent negotiations of control and desire. The office, emptied of others, was a stage for proximity, subtle touches, and unspoken acknowledgments of tension. A brush of her hand against a stack of papers, the faintest hesitation when handing him a folder, the quiet acknowledgement in her eyes when he offered a rare word of praise. Each small act carried significance neither could fully articulate. Marvel was acutely aware of how much she noticed him, how attuned she had become to the slightest shift in his mood, and how vulnerable that awareness made her feel. Jamil's guilt was constant. He was married, committed in theory if not in emotional intimacy. Miriam Tomford existed in the background, her name a reminder of boundaries, of loyalty, of the life he had promised to uphold. And yet, every interaction with Marvel chipped away at that resolve. He felt the pull of her presence like gravity, an invisible force that defied the walls he had erected. She was brilliant, poised, alluring without intention, and dangerously attuned to the nuances of his mind and moods. That he should feel so drawn, so dependent on her insight and presence, filled him with shame, and yet he could not stop himself. Marvel sensed it too, the tension in his voice when he spoke quietly to her after the last of the staff had left, the subtle flicker in his eyes when he lingered in her presence, the way he allowed her advice to steer even high-stakes decisions. She knew she had power over him in ways she had not anticipated, and the knowledge made her both cautious and emboldened. Their connection was a delicate balance. He had authority, yet she had influence. He had wealth, yet she had insight. And the awareness of this imbalance made every conversation, every glance, every accidental touch feel charged with consequence. The emotional intimacy deepened quietly, invisibly threading itself through their days. Marvel began to anticipate his moods, noticing tension before he spoke, offering counsel before he asked. Jamil found himself seeking her input in moments of stress, leaning on her perspective as if it were a lifeline. They had not crossed physical boundaries beyond proximity and fleeting touches, but the emotional closeness was undeniable. It was dependence, mutual, unspoken, and dangerous. Guilt threaded through every thought, every action. Marvel felt it for herself, for the line she was slowly approaching, for the allure she could not deny. Jamil felt it for his marriage, for the vows he had exchanged, for the life he had promised Miriam. And yet neither could sever the connection. The balance of power, subtle and shifting, made every moment between them heavier, every glance weighted, every touch electric with meaning. By the end of one long evening, Marvel left the office with a quiet sense of both exhilaration and fear. She had crossed the line emotionally, perhaps irrevocably, and she understood that the stakes were higher than she had anticipated. Jamil remained behind, staring at the city skyline through the windows, aware of the growing gravity of their connection, aware of the line they had begun to blur. For both of them, the thrill was inseparable from the guilt, and the pull of each other's presence was impossible to ignore. They had not acted overtly, but the line between professional and personal, between restraint and desire, had been challenged, and neither could return to the simplicity of before. The tension was no longer just a whisper. It had become a living, breathing presence in their lives, quietly binding them to each other in ways that would only grow heavier with time. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, both knew that their next choice might shatter everything they had known. Miriam Tomford noticed it first in small, almost imperceptible ways. The way Jamil lingered slightly longer over his phone in the evenings, the subtle shift in his tone when discussing mundane tasks, the way his posture softened or stiffened when he thought she wasn't looking. Nothing was dramatic. Nothing screamed betrayal, yet she knew him well enough to sense the change. A thread had been pulled somewhere, and it reverberated quietly through the life they shared. She observed from a distance, the careful scrutiny of someone who had shared years with a man and understood every nuance of his behavior. Miriam did not confront him, not yet, but she watched, noting details that might seem insignificant to anyone else. Marvel Park was competent, brilliant even, and Miriam had met many who sought to impress him. But there was a weight to her presence, a subtle command in her calm demeanor that set her apart. Miriam did not need words to notice it. She could see the way Jamil responded, the way his attention shifted almost imperceptibly when Marvel was near. Jamil himself did not realize how obvious it had become. His emotional dependence, subtle though it was, had begun to show in ways he hadn't intended. A softened gaze, a quiet pause, a faint lift of his brow when Marvel offered insight. These were the small betrayals of habit, invisible to anyone less familiar with him than Miriam. And she was familiar. Too familiar. She understood the patterns, the rhythms, the tiny gestures that revealed when something, or someone, had claimed a piece of his focus. Marvel, blissfully unaware of Miriam's scrutiny, continued her work, thinking only of her responsibilities and the subtle tension she felt whenever she was near Jamil. She interpreted his attention as professional interest, a rare recognition of her skill and efficiency. She did not yet know how apparent the unspoken thread of connection had become to someone who understood Jamil as intimately as Miriam did. One evening, Miriam noticed him linger at the edge of his office, staring at a document, yet his mind was clearly elsewhere. She observed him silently from the doorway of their shared apartment later, the domestic quiet of home contrasting with the tension she had detected in the office. He carried himself as if burdened by more than work alone, and she felt it, a subtle, unspoken truth. The familiar lines of his face, the almost imperceptible restlessness in his hands, the way his eyes sought something beyond her presence, it all told a story he would never confess. Miriam did not act impulsively. She did not storm the office, demand explanations, or confront either of them. Instead, she watched, quietly and deliberately. She had always understood that control was sometimes maintained best through observation rather than action, and the subtle signs she noticed gave her insight that she did not yet need to verbalize. She could wait. She could plan. She could see exactly where the thread was beginning to pull taut, and she could trust herself to act at the precise moment it became necessary. Meanwhile, Marvel continued to navigate the office with her usual precision, unaware of the silent scrutiny she was under. Every late night, every private flight, every moment of proximity with Jamil carried with it an undercurrent of risk she could not see. She felt the tension between them, yes, but she had no idea how visible it had become, how quietly potent the thread of their secret had grown. Jamil, increasingly aware of the magnetic pull of her presence, began to recognize the strain of maintaining normalcy in the face of his growing attachment. Every glance, every touch, every shared secret of thought added weight to the invisible bond forming between them. He felt guilt for the dependence he was cultivating, but also a strange, undeniable relief that she seemed capable of steadying him in ways few others could. The office had become a private world, a place where rules existed only in theory, a space where connections simmered beneath the surface of professionalism. Miriam noticed the signs of imbalance long before either of them acknowledged them. She noticed the subtle changes in his schedule, the way his energy shifted when Marvel was involved, and the lingering focus he carried after leaving meetings with her assistant. She did not accuse, she did not confront. She waited, watching the thread pull taut, noting the precise moments when his gaze softened, when his attention lingered too long, when his composure faltered just slightly. To Miriam, it was all visible. the quiet, creeping intimacy that had begun to bloom between Jamil and Marvel. The tension between what was and what could be became a silent third presence in the office, an unspoken awareness that hovered over every interaction. Marvel remained unaware, and Jamil teetered on the edge of awareness, pulled toward her while burdened by his obligations, trapped by the duality of desire and loyalty. And Miriam, ever observant, understood both sides, her knowledge sharp, quiet, and patient, waiting for the moment when the invisible line might break. By the end of the week, the office seemed smaller, more charged, each glance and subtle gesture carrying weight beyond the superficial tasks they performed. The first secret had grown heavier, the emotional dependence had intensified, and the eyes watching quietly from afar ensured that nothing would remain unseen forever. For Jamil and Marvel, the tension was intoxicating, thrilling, and dangerous. For Miriam, it was a puzzle she could solve in time, a quiet awareness of what had begun and what might yet threaten everything. The balance had shifted, invisibly and irrevocably. One could not act without consequence, one could not touch without awareness. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between late-night emails, hushed office interactions, and lingering glances, all three understood, whether spoken or not, that their lives were entwined in a story that had only begun to unfold. The office was nearly silent, save for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Jamil Bright sat behind his desk, the documents before him untouched. For once, work did not command his attention, Marvel Park did. He had spent weeks relying on her without fully admitting it, letting her insight, presence, and calm anchor him in ways that had nothing to do with her role as assistant. And yet tonight, the weight of reality pressed down. She had stayed late like she often did, organizing reports, reviewing schedules, preparing for meetings he would oversee the next day. The quiet between them stretched longer than usual, filled with tension, anticipation, and a knowledge they both shared but had not yet spoken aloud. Jamil leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, and studied her in the dim light. She looked exhausted, her posture tense from the long hours, yet her eyes held the spark that had captivated him from day one. "Marvel," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a weight that made her heart stutter. She looked up, meeting his gaze, sensing the shift in tone. He did not issue instructions or ask questions. Instead, he allowed the words to linger between them, unspoken yet powerful. "I can't keep doing this," he continued, the admission slow, careful, as though each word was weighed against the consequences he knew he would face. "What we're doing, what's happening between us, it's not sustainable. I have responsibilities. I have commitments I can't ignore." Marvel's chest tightened. She had sensed this moment approaching, had felt the tension of their connection teetering on the edge of exposure, yet hearing it confirmed filled her with a mix of fear and longing. She nodded slowly, words failing her at first. Finally, she spoke, voice quiet but steady. "I know," she said. "I've known, but it doesn't make it any easier to just let it go." Jamil's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability breaking through his otherwise controlled exterior. He leaned back slightly, letting the weight of what he was about to propose settle in. "One last night," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying the gravity of the decision. "After tonight it ends. No more secret emails, no more late nights, no more everything. One night, Marvel, then we stop." Marvel swallowed, the ache in her chest sharp and immediate. She had imagined this moment, dreaded it, and secretly longed for it. The promise was both a relief and a torment, a chance to linger in the forbidden intimacy they had cultivated, and yet a cruel reminder that it could not last. "One night," she repeated softly, allowing herself to accept the weight of it. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the struggle between his desire and his duty. She had come to rely on him emotionally, just as he had come to rely on her. The thought of separation was terrifying, yet she understood the necessity. Jamil rose from his chair, moving toward her with a quiet determination. He did not reach for her, did not touch her, but his presence filled the room, commanding and intimate. Marvel felt the familiar pull, the invisible force that had always drawn her attention, heightened tonight by the knowledge of what was to come. "This doesn't undo anything," he said quietly, "but it's all we have before reality hits. We can't cross this line again after tonight. Not with me. Not with everything else that matters." Marvel nodded again, absorbing the gravity of the promise. It was a final acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, the emotional dependence, the unspoken intimacy, the subtle threads of desire that had woven between them. And yet, it was also a boundary, a line drawn clearly in the shifting sand of temptation. They sat across from each other in the quiet office, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. Neither spoke for long moments, the silence heavy with anticipation, with regret, with longing. Every glance carried meaning, every slight movement amplified by the weight of their decision. They had created something neither could deny, yet now they had to reconcile it with the reality they both knew they could not escape. Finally, Marvel stood, gathering her bag, her posture tight with unspoken emotion. Jamil remained seated, watching her every movement, memorizing the curve of her shoulders, the set of her jaw, the quiet tension in her hands. "One night," he said again, voice low, as if reminding both of them of the fragile promise. Marvel met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No words were needed beyond that. They both understood the rules, the boundaries, and the inevitability of the separation that would follow. As she left the office that night, the promise lingered in the air, heavy and tangible. Both understood it fully. Tonight would be the night when everything they had denied themselves would be allowed, emotionally, fully, and without restraint. Then it would end. The line had been crossed before, subtly, but tonight it would be acknowledged and sealed, if only for a fleeting span of hours. The tension of anticipation was almost unbearable. Neither could sleep. Neither could focus on the mundane tasks of life. Both were tethered to the knowledge of the night ahead, to the forbidden intimacy they would share one final time, and to the cruel awareness that what followed would be silence, separation, and the lingering ache of what could never exist openly between them. One night, one promise, and the weight of everything unspoken, forbidden, and irresistible settled between them like a storm waiting to break. The city outside the window pulsed with life, a distant heartbeat against the quiet intensity that filled the penthouse suite. Marvel Park stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the glow of streetlights painting her silhouette, and felt the weight of the night pressing down. One night, one final chance to feel the presence of a man who had become the center of her thoughts, her strength, and her longing. Jamil Bright leaned against the edge of the desk, watching her carefully. His suit, crisp and deliberate, seemed a shield against the vulnerability he felt, but Marvel saw through it. She had known him long enough to recognize the subtle shifts, how his posture softened when she entered the room, how his gaze lingered a fraction too long, how his hands flexed in anticipation. He was as aware of her pull as she was of his, and tonight the distance between them had narrowed to a threadbare line of restraint. "You're here," he said quietly, almost a whisper. Yet it carried the full weight of acknowledgement. Marvel turned, meeting his eyes, and in that instant the rest of the world fell away. She felt the magnetic force of his presence, the same force that had quietly tethered her to him in office meetings, during late nights, in moments of shared insight. Tonight it was intensified, urgent, impossible to ignore. She approached him slowly, aware of every step, every movement, every heartbeat that seemed synchronized with his own. They had promised each other restraint, yet the tension between them made it impossible to act normally. A soft sigh escaped her, not from fatigue but from the anticipation that had been building over weeks. Jamil's lips pressed into a tight line, his jaw tense, betraying the control he struggled to maintain. They did not speak for long. Words would have ruined the delicate intimacy of the moment, a tension that was both fragile and combustible. Marvel reached for a folder on the desk, pretending to be occupied, but Jamil's eyes followed her every movement. It was a dance of unspoken acknowledgement, a slow, deliberate exchange of glances, of subtle touches, of proximity that neither dared to fully name. The night unfolded in a quiet rhythm. They shared drinks, exchanged thoughts about trivial matters, reminisced briefly about small victories at work, and yet every interaction carried weight. The brush of a hand against a glass, the unintentional touch as she handed him a pen, the way they moved around the suite. It was intimate without being spoken, romantic without being overt. Each gesture amplified the tension, each silence thickened with meaning, each glance a promise of the connection that neither could fully articulate. Marvel finally sat across from him, the low light highlighting the contours of her face. "It feels strange," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet for the first time in minutes, "to know that tonight ends it all." Jamil's gaze softened. "I know," he said, voice low and steady, "and yet it doesn't make it any easier." He shifted slightly closer, careful not to cross the invisible barrier, and Marvel felt the warmth radiating from him, the subtle gravity that had drawn her in from the very beginning. They existed in the same space, tethered by something neither could name but both recognized, the culmination of weeks of silent understanding, emotional dependence, and forbidden connection. Time stretched, almost elastic, each minute imbued with significance. They reminisced quietly, sharing moments from the past weeks that had drawn them closer, the late nights in the office, the brief private flights, the soft laughter in the moments when the world outside felt distant. Each memory carried intimacy, a private knowledge of each other that no one else could ever access. It was emotional intimacy, the kind that lingered in the mind long after physical contact, the kind that left hearts aching in its absence. Marvel's hand brushed against his as she reached for her glass, and neither pulled away immediately. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet charged with a lifetime of unspoken acknowledgement. Jamil's gaze held hers, steady, vulnerable in ways he rarely allowed, and she felt a shiver of anticipation that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the intensity of connection. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Conversation softened, laughter diminished, and the quiet intimacy of simply being near each other took over. There were no words for what they felt, no declarations, no confessions, only presence, attention, and the knowledge that this night was theirs alone. They allowed themselves to linger in proximity, to exist in the rare space where desire, care, and unspoken affection intertwined seamlessly. As the first hint of dawn crept along the horizon, painting the city in muted gold, Marvel stood once more by the window. Jamil remained close, a subtle warmth in the space between them. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The night had carried all they could give each other: acknowledgement, understanding, longing, and the fragile beauty of intimacy untainted by recklessness. Finally, Marvel turned to him. "One night," she said softly, "a confirmation, a farewell, a promise." "One night," he echoed, a quiet echo of her sentiment carrying both gratitude and regret. They held the silence for a moment longer, hearts synchronized in unspoken understanding before parting to face the reality they had agreed to accept. The night had been theirs, emotionally complete and impossibly fleeting, and as the sun rose, the weight of the world returned, the life, the obligations, the separation. But the memory of this forbidden night lingered, an indelible mark on both their hearts. The office felt different the next morning, colder somehow, stripped of the quiet intimacy that had lingered like a secret fragrance just hours before. Marvel Park arrived early, as usual, but the routine that had once carried comfort now felt hollow. Each step across the polished floors echoed the absence she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. One night had been enough to change everything, yet it had also cemented the impossibility of continuation. Jamil Bright, as expected, was already at his desk when she arrived. The man who had dominated her thoughts, pulled at her heart, and anchored her emotional state now seemed restrained, measured, deliberately distant. He greeted her with the formality of employer and assistant, his tone precise, neutral, yet she could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way his eyes flickered ever so briefly in her direction before returning to work. It was deliberate, it was protective, and it was painful. Marvel felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against her chest. They had promised themselves one night, and they had honored it. But the silence that followed was heavier than any physical separation could have been. Every glance avoided, every casual interaction measured, was a reminder of the boundary they had drawn and the cost of crossing it. She moved through the morning tasks with precision, her mind a careful balance between focus and memory, recalling moments from the night that now belonged only to her. Jamil, for his part, felt the absence of her presence in ways he had not anticipated. The comfort, the laughter, the emotional tether he had relied on for weeks, all gone in an instant. His hands gripped the edge of his desk as he tried to steady himself, trying to reconcile the reality of his marriage, his responsibilities, and the undeniable pull Marvel had on him. Every instinct urged him to speak, to reach across the space, to reclaim even a fragment of the connection. Yet the promise lingered, a tether to restraint, to duty, to the inevitable end of their secret. The following days were a careful dance of avoidance. Marvel submitted reports promptly, responded to calls and emails with efficiency, and maintained the professionalism that had first earned Jamil's respect. Yet beneath the surface, every interaction carried tension, subtle and electric. She noticed the way he hesitated slightly before speaking, the faint pause in his movements, the moments when his gaze lingered just long enough to remind her of the night they had shared. Neither spoke of it, neither acknowledged the lingering connection, yet it thrummed between them like a heartbeat neither could ignore. Marvel eventually tendered her resignation. The decision had been inevitable. The office could no longer be a place of both comfort and danger. She understood that leaving was not just about physical separation, but about reclaiming control over her emotional life. She drafted the letter with care, ensuring professionalism while embedding a quiet finality that mirrored the promise they had made. Delivering it to Jamil was a test of restraint, a final acknowledgement of the emotional tether they shared. Jamil accepted her resignation without protest, his tone measured, his expression unreadable to anyone but Marvel. Yet she could see the tension beneath the surface, the struggle between desire and duty, between acknowledgement and denial. No words were spoken beyond the formalities, but the room carried the residue of what had been. The intimacy, the reliance, the forbidden connection. They both understood the rules they had set, yet the silence screamed louder than any confession ever could. After she left the office for the final time, the quiet between them became unbearable. Emails went unanswered beyond necessity, calls were avoided, and social interactions were limited to the barest professional requirement. The distance was deliberate, a protective measure against the pull they both felt, yet it left an emptiness neither could escape. Every thought of her brought a mixture of longing and regret. Every memory of their time together was tinged with both warmth and sorrow. Jamil returned fully to his marriage, to the life he had built and the obligations he could not ignore. Miriam noticed the shift immediately, not because of confrontation, but because the quiet between them had changed. He was present, yet slightly withdrawn, a man aware of the emotional storm he had contained, and the night that had altered the fabric of his life. He moved carefully through domestic routines, maintaining appearances, yet the memory of Marvel lingered, a constant, invisible presence that reminded him of what he had relinquished. Marvel, for her part, faced the challenge of rebuilding her emotional equilibrium. She moved through the city with precision, throwing herself into work, social interactions, and personal projects, yet the memory of one night, the one night of intimacy, connection, and understanding, remained vivid. She had given herself to the emotional closeness they shared, and now that bond was a ghost, present in memory but absent in reality. Weeks turned into months and the silence remained. It was a constant companion, heavier than any conversation could have been. The office became a place of efficiency, not intimacy. The late nights, shared insights, and quiet touches were relegated to memory. Jamil and Marvel existed in parallel lives now, connected by a thread that could not be severed completely but could no longer be nurtured. The absence became a presence in itself, a reminder of what had been possible, what had been forbidden, and what had been relinquished. In the end, separation was both punishment and preservation. They had honored the promise, respected the boundaries, and acknowledged the impossibility of continuation. Yet the emotional bond, forged in quiet intimacy and subtle dependence, lingered, impossible to erase. Each moved forward, but each carried a silent, private weight, the memory of one night, one connection, one forbidden thread that had irrevocably changed them. The months after Marvel Park's resignation were quieter than either of them had imagined. The rhythm of their lives resumed outwardly, yet beneath the surface, nothing had returned to normal. Marvel had rebuilt her mornings, her routines, her independence, but the memory of the nights, the unspoken intimacy, the quiet connection she had shared with Jamil Bright lingered in every choice she made. It was a ghost she could neither confront nor deny, woven into the fabric of her days in subtle, persistent ways. She moved through the city with a careful focus, throwing herself into her own projects, building small routines that reminded her of the autonomy she had fought to maintain. Coffee shops became a sanctuary, early morning walks a way to reclaim herself. Yet in the midst of her carefully constructed independence, she would catch herself thinking of him, his voice in the quiet of the office, the warmth of his presence that had been hers for a fleeting, impossible night, the quiet strength she had come to rely on without admitting it. It was emotional dependence carried into absence, bittersweet and impossible to escape. Jamil's life, too, bore the consequences of their affair. Though unspoken, it was palpable. Miriam noticed it most clearly. His presence at home was precise, measured, deliberate, but the energy that had once radiated naturally from him was subdued. His laughter, once effortless, came only after thought, filtered through the obligations he carried as husband, CEO, and man aware of the emotional storm he had left behind. The tension of restraint, the memory of what he had shared with Marvel, created cracks in the seamless facade he had carefully built. Conversations at home became cautious, measured, careful. Miriam noticed the subtle shifts, the pauses before he answered questions, the quiet absence in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She did not confront him, did not accuse, yet she felt the strain, an invisible tension that neither spouse could articulate. It was the echo of intimacy that had belonged to someone else, a presence neither could see but both felt in the silent spaces between words and gestures. Marvel, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her own choices in unexpected ways. She discovered that independence carried its own loneliness. The thrill of emotional closeness she had shared with Jamil had become a standard, a benchmark against which all other interactions now seemed measured. Colleagues, friends, even casual acquaintances lacked the depth, the subtle understanding, the quiet tether that had defined her connection with him. And yet she could not reach for it again, not without crossing boundaries she had sworn to respect. The longing persisted. Small things triggered memories, a glance from someone at a cafe, the soft resonance of a voice in conversation, the unexpected warmth of a hand lightly touching hers in passing. Each instance reminded her of the intimacy she had relinquished, of the emotional tether she had allowed herself to explore for one night. The ache of absence was sharpened by the impossibility of return. She had chosen separation, yet the cost remained unrelenting. Jamil, too, felt the weight of consequence in ways he could not ignore. Every decision at work carried the echo of her insight. Every late night reminded him of the conversations they had shared. Every achievement was shadowed by the absence of her presence. He had returned fully to his marriage, yet the bond he had formed with Marvel could not be untangled so easily. Emotional dependence, once nurtured, lingered stubbornly, quietly shaping his thoughts and actions even in her absence. The ripple effects extended beyond them individually. Marvel's growth in independence, her resilience in navigating life without him, became a testament to her strength. Yet there was always a quiet reminder of what she had relinquished, the man who had made her feel seen, understood, and valued in ways no one else had. Jamil's marriage, too, became a complex balance of love, obligation, and unspoken tension. He remained present, committed, yet haunted subtly by a bond he could neither acknowledge nor sever entirely. In moments of solitude, both reflected on what had transpired. Marvel would revisit the quiet intimacy of their one night, the shared presence, the unspoken acknowledgement, the emotional vulnerability that had defined it. Jamil would recall the warmth, the understanding, the delicate closeness, and feel a pang of longing sharpened by restraint. The consequences were not dramatic, not explosive, but quietly persistent. A tension that neither could resolve, a connection that had left its mark on both their lives. It became clear that one night had consequences far greater than the hours it had spanned. It had changed their expectations of closeness, altered emotional priorities, and left both of them navigating the world with a subtle, invisible weight. One night had been enough, not for destruction, not for chaos, but for a quiet, persistent reminder that some bonds once formed cannot be erased. And so life continued, outwardly calm, inwardly complex. Marvel Park rebuilt herself piece by piece, navigating independence and longing in equal measure. Jamil Bright maintained his marriage and empire, a man disciplined, measured, yet quietly tethered to the memory of a connection he had allowed for just one night. Both moved forward, both carried the consequences, and both understood deeply that the threads of what they had shared would remain woven into their lives forever. The city was quiet that evening, the golden light of sunset spilling across glass towers and crowded streets alike. Marvel Park walked into the art gallery, her eyes drawn instinctively to the vibrant canvases, the soft hum of classical music blending with distant conversations. She moved with the ease of someone who had rebuilt her life meticulously, balancing independence, ambition, and the careful remnants of longing that lingered from a night she could never forget. And then she saw him. Jamil Bright stood across the room, impeccably dressed, the same commanding presence that had captivated her months ago. But now he was different, less tethered by unspoken boundaries, more grounded yet carrying the subtle weight of restraint and memory. Their eyes met, and for the first time since their separation, the air between them shifted with recognition, anticipation, and unspoken understanding. Time seemed to bend around them, the distance of months collapsing into the instant of a shared glance. Marvel felt her chest tighten, a mix of nostalgia, longing, and a thrill she had thought she had buried under routine and independence. She approached slowly, measuring each step, aware of every detail. The way his posture remained poised, the subtle warmth of his gaze, the faint curl of his lips that suggested both acknowledgement and restraint. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary when the energy between them carried the weight of everything unsaid. "Marvel," he said finally, voice low, deliberate, carrying the unmistakable echo of familiarity. She smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgement, the corners of her lips betraying emotions she otherwise kept guarded. "Jamil," she replied, tone measured yet gentle, her gaze steady on him. The one-night secret they had shared lingered in the space between them, invisible to the world but palpable to both. Every fiber of her being recognized him, even after months apart, even after rebuilding herself. They moved through the gallery together, side by side but not touching, each step a careful dance of proximity and restraint. Conversations were polite, measured, yet under each word lay layers of history, longing, and subtle emotional intimacy that neither could deny. They talked of art, of trends, of mutual acquaintances, and yet every pause, every glance, every quiet acknowledgement carried unspoken weight. The memories of late nights, private flights, and moments of forbidden emotional closeness that had irrevocably changed them. As they paused before a painting of a storm-tossed sea, Jamil's gaze drifted from the canvas to Marvel. "I didn't expect to see you here," he admitted quietly, a subtle vulnerability in his voice. Marvel met his gaze, recognizing the honesty and the acknowledgement, the quiet tug of connection that neither distance nor time had erased. "I didn't expect to see you either," she replied, her tone soft but charged with the residual emotion they had carefully buried. "Life, it moves forward, but some things don't fade as easily as we hope." The subtle truth hung between them. They had moved forward in separate directions, but the bond they had forged, the one night that had allowed them to feel what had been forbidden yet undeniable, had left an indelible mark. Neither had spoken of it beyond necessity, yet each recognized the thread that still tethered them to the other. For a moment time slowed. The gallery around them blurred into insignificance as they stood in quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had survived months of separation. Jamil, ever precise, deliberate, yet vulnerable in a way reserved only for moments like this, took a measured breath. "Marvel, was one night ever enough?" he asked, the question soft, almost a whisper, yet carrying the weight of every choice, every longing, every regret between them. Marvel's gaze held his. She felt the familiar pull, the thread that had once held them in a suspended reality of forbidden intimacy, emotional dependence and understanding. "It was enough," she said finally, a quiet strength beneath her words, "to know what could exist between us, and to know what we had to let go of." The air shifted again, charged with acknowledgement, acceptance, and the bittersweet weight of memory. They did not reach for each other. They did not break the careful rhythm they had maintained for months. Instead, they stood together, side by side, hearts quietly tethered by the shared understanding of what had been, what had changed, and what they had survived. Jamil offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We survived it," he said, voice low, measured, "and we carry it in our own way." Marvel nodded, feeling a quiet serenity in the acknowledgement. "Yes," she said, "and sometimes that's enough." As the gallery lights dimmed and the evening deepened into night, they parted with grace, neither needing more than the quiet understanding between them. Fate had brought them face to face again, not as boss and assistant, not as temptation and restraint, but as two people who had shared something impossible and had survived it. The question of what could have been remained unspoken, but the truth was clear. One night had left its mark, had shaped their lives, and had changed them in ways neither could forget. And in that recognition, there was peace, a reckoning of the heart, a closure without the need for further compromise, and the quiet satisfaction of surviving love's most dangerous, most intoxicating temptation. They walked away from each other that night, fully aware of the connection that remained, and fully committed to the lives they had built apart. And in the quiet spaces of memory, in fleeting thoughts and moments of reflection, they both knew one night had been enough.